Hey there, folks. You know, somebody once told me that the best thing that a pastor can do is just be honest. I've thought a lot recently about the decisions that are made on behalf of other people. And it's probably, my thought process is probably somewhat exacerbated because there is this ongoing social media conflict between folks who, are trying to follow the governor's orders with the quarantine, and then there are folks who feel like this has impinged on their freedoms, and they feel like someone's made decisions on their behalf, essentially. And so we have these two groups who are in utter conflict and are going back and forth with name calling and just saying some really hurtful stuff back and forth. And I try to just kind of stay out of this sort of stuff. I think today I just want to make mention of the fact that these sort of conflicts online, especially in a time like quarantine where a lot of our interaction is online, these things can be detrimental to our spirit. They can really just drive us down, make us feel pretty tired, and make us feel a little lost and even a little depressed, because what we see constantly is not good news. It's just more fighting. And so I guess today I feel a little down, and I just want to be honest about that with you and say that maybe that's where you're at too. Maybe you're kind of tired of all the fighting and the bickering. You're tired of everything always being divided into two sides, and those two sides seem to have an inability to work together or even come to the table sometimes. And that's kind of where I'm at this morning. And so I guess I want to share a little bit about hope. Hope is really important to each of us, and we need to find our hope in Jesus. There's no better place for us to have that hope. Hope is not something that is locked into a government. It's not something that's locked into an elected official. It's not something that's locked into local, state, or federal governments. Hope is not something that we find in a paycheck or a retirement account. It's not something we find in job security. Hope is something that we find in Jesus, because even if all of the other stuff evaporates, at the end of the day, we have Jesus, and we have his work in our life, and we have his work in our community. And so that is where I find my hope. And so I think I've been a pretty open book with you guys about my own life, about my own journey. And I think back to some of the things that have happened in my life, or the periphery of my life, the people around me, where choices were made for them that they didn't choose. And I think about a car accident where somebody wrecks on black ice, and they didn't choose to put the ice there, and they didn't choose the outcome of the accident. And I think about an accident where a piece of equipment fails and somebody ends up paralyzed because of it. I think about miscarriages, and I think about even my own daughters, having lost them in the hospital. I think about cancer and how people, good, wonderful people, are diagnosed with cancer through no choice or fault of their own. I think about the people who I know, even who've had the coronavirus, something that they tried to stay safe from and still got. I think about people that I know who have lost people to this virus, and how hard that is too. And it's really easy, if I stay focused on those things, to lose my perspective and to think about how hard things are and how unfair things are. But there's a place that we can put our hope. There's a place that when we realize that God is doing something bigger than we can see right now, we can have hope in that. And I know that might sound like a bit of faulty logic to some of you. Well, how can you hope in that? I don't know that I can explain that. All I can say is that God's done a work in my spirit and a work in my heart. And I believe that God is using even the bad stuff, the unfair stuff, for something greater. I do. I think that we all have dreams and hopes and a vision for the future. And rarely, if ever, do all of those dreams and hopes and visions work out exactly the way we thought they would. But in the midst of them not working out, we are on a journey as we watch God use those things for something different, better, greater than we could have guessed. I want to tell you a story about 3 little trees. Once upon a mountaintop, 3 little trees stood and dreamed of what they wanted to become when they grew up. The first little tree looked up at the stars and said, "I want to hold treasure. I want to be covered with gold and filled with precious stones. I'll be the most beautiful treasure chest in the world." The second little tree looked out at the small stream trickling by on its way to the ocean. "I want to be traveling mighty waters and carrying powerful kings. I'll be the strongest ship in the world." The third little tree looked down into the valley, below where busy men and women worked in a busy town. "I don't want to leave the mountaintop at all. I want to grow so tall that when people stop to look at me, they'll raise their eyes to heaven and think of God. I want to be the tallest tree in the world." Years passed by, the rain came, the sun shone, and the little trees grew tall. One day, 3 woodcutters climbed the mountain. The first woodcutter saw the first tree and said, "This tree is beautiful. It's perfect for me." With a swoop of his shining axe, the first tree fell. "Now I shall be made into the most beautiful chest. I shall hold wonderful treasure," the first tree said. The second woodcutter looked at the second tree and said, "This tree is strong. It is perfect for me." With a swoop of his shining axe, the second tree fell. "Now I shall sail mighty waters," thought the second tree. "I shall be a strong ship for mighty kings." The third tree felt her heart sink when the last woodcutter looked her way. She stood straight and tall and pointed bravely to heaven, but the woodcutter never even looked up. "Any kind of tree will do for me," he muttered. With a swoop of his shining axe, the third tree fell. The first tree rejoiced when the woodcutter brought her to a carpenter's shop, but the carpenter fashioned the tree into a feed box for animals. The once beautiful tree was not covered with gold, with treasure. She was coated with sawdust and filled with hay for hungry farm animals. The second tree smiled when the woodcutter took her to a shipyard, but no mighty sailing ship was made that day. Instead, the once strong tree was hammered and sawed into a simple fishing boat. She was too small and too weak to sail an ocean or even a river. Instead, she was taken to a little lake. The third tree was confused when the woodcutter cut her into strong beams and left her in a lumberyard. What happened? The once tall tree wondered. All I ever wanted was to stay on top of the mountain and point to God. Many, many days and nights passed. The 3 trees nearly forgot their dreams. But one night, golden starlight poured over the first tree as a young woman placed her newborn baby in the feed box. "I wish I could make a cradle for him," her husband whispered. The mother squeezed his hand and smiled as the starlight shone on the smooth and the sturdy wood. "This manger is beautiful," she said. And suddenly the first tree knew he was holding the greatest treasure in the whole world. One evening, a tired traveler and his friends crowded into an old fishing boat. The traveler fell asleep as the second tree quietly sailed out onto the lake. Soon a thundering and thrashing storm arose. The little tree shuddered. She knew she didn't have the strength to carry so many passengers safely through the wind and the rain. The tired man awakened. He stood up, stretched out his hand, and said, "Peace." The storm stopped as quickly as it had begun. And suddenly the second tree knew he was carrying the King of heaven and earth. One Friday morning, the third tree was startled when her beams were yanked from the forgotten woodpile. She flinched as she was carried through an angry, jeering crowd. She shuddered, when soldiers nailed a man's hands to her. She felt ugly and harsh and cruel. But on Sunday morning, when the sun rose and the earth trembled with joy beneath her, the third tree knew that God's love had changed everything. It had made the third tree strong, and every time people thought of the third tree, they would think of God. And that was far better than being the tallest tree in the world. Look, I'm not saying that a story about three little trees solves everything. I'm not saying the story about three little trees is going to give you all the answers that you want about everything that's going on in our world right now. What I hope is that you hope. Is that you can find it in your heart. You can find it in your spirit. To know that in the midst of the arguments, in the midst of the fighting, in the midst of the disagreements, in the midst of the conflict that seems to surround us all the time these days, God is doing something. And someday, we are all going to look back on this with an entirely different perspective than we have right now. And we're going to be able to see how God was using each of these things so that you carried King of Kings, that you carried the greatest treasure, so that when people look at you, they see God. I hope today that you hope. Have a good day.